Hello, weary traveler of the modern world. Where are you listening to this tonight? Perhaps you're nestled beneath warm blankets in a quiet bedroom. Or maybe you're walking through the gentle darkness of your neighborhood, earbuds carrying these words into your tired mind. What time is it where you are? Late evening, when the world begins to settle into its ancient rhythm of rest. Or perhaps it's that precious hour just past midnight, when sleep feels both necessary and elusive. I invite you to stay with me for a while, to let these words wash over you like a gentle tide. If you find comfort in these nighttime journeys through history, I hope you'll return to hear more stories from the shadows of the past. But for now, simply breathe deeply and allow yourself to drift backward through the centuries, away from the harsh lights of our modern world, and into the flickering amber glow of ancient Rome. Tonight, we journey to a place where marble columns reach toward the heavens and the forum bustled with the voices of senators and merchants. But we are not going to walk among the powerful tonight. No, our path leads us down narrow stone steps, past the grand villas and gleaming temples, into the forgotten corners where history's most vulnerable souls struggled to survive. Tonight, we explore why being an orphan in ancient Rome was a fate so cruel, so utterly devastating, that it haunts us still across to millennia of human progress. We will walk in the worn sandals of those who had no family name to protect them, no patron to shield them, no warm hearth to call home. These were the forgotten children of the greatest empire the world had ever known, and their stories deserve to be told in the gentle darkness of this night. Close your eyes now, if you can. Feel your breathing slow. Let the weight of your day begin to lift from your shoulders like morning mist rising from the Tiber River. We are going back to a time when the world was both magnificent and merciless, when a child without parents faced terrors that would make the strongest among us weep. But do not fear these stories, dear listener. Though they speak of suffering, they also speak of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. They remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, people found ways to endure, to hope, to create meaning from pain. And perhaps, as you drift toward sleep tonight, these ancient echoes will remind you of how fortunate we are to live in an age where childhood is protected, where orphans have advocates, where no child need face the world entirely alone. So settle deeper into your comfort, let your muscles relax, and prepare to journey with me into the cobblestone streets and shadowed alleys of ancient Rome, where the most heartbreaking stories of human endurance were written in tears and determination. There is a Latin phrase that still echoes through the centuries: sin mater, sin petri, sin spe, without mother, without father, without hope. These words carved themselves into the hearts of countless children who wandered the streets of Rome during the height of the empire, when the city's population swelled to over 1 million souls, and among them were thousands upon thousands of children with no one to call their own. Picture, if you will, the magnificent marble of the Pantheon gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, while just a few streets away, a 7-year-old child with matted hair and hollow cheeks searches desperately through refuse for anything edible. This was the devastating contradiction of Roman orphanhood. Surrounded by the greatest wealth and architectural wonders the world had ever seen, yet existing in a state of abandonment so complete that death was often preferable to life. The Roman legal system, for all its famous innovations, held no protection for parentless children. In fact, Roman law was brutally clear. Children were property. They belonged to the paterfamilias, the male head of household, who held the power of life and death over them through the doctrine of patria potestas. When that protective umbrella was stripped away by death, disease, or abandonment, a child became what the Romans called sin tutela, without protection. And, in ancient Rome, to be without protection was to be prey. The numbers are staggering in their quiet horror. Historians estimate that up to 30% of all children born in Rome never reached their 5th birthday. Disease, malnutrition, accident, and violence claimed them with relentless efficiency. But for every child who died, another was left behind, orphaned by plague, war, childbirth complications, or the 1,000 other ways death visited Roman households with cruel regularity. These orphaned children faced what we can only describe as systematic erasure from society. Without a family name nomen, they had no legal identity. Without a patron, they had no economic protection. Without inheritance, they had no future. They became what the Romans dismissively called sin noman, the nameless ones, existing in the margins of society like human shadows. The cruelty was not merely neglect, though neglect was devastating enough. Roman society actively created conditions that made orphan survival nearly impossible. The grain dole, that famous Roman welfare system, was limited to adult male citizens with fixed addresses. Children qualified for nothing. The guilds and professional associations that provided economic opportunity required family connections or the ability to pay substantial fees. The military, which offered advancement to ambitious young men, demanded proof of legitimate birth and citizen status. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the Roman practice of infanticidium, the legal abandonment of unwanted children. Newborns were regularly left at crossroads, in temples, or on rubbish heaps, technically alive, but effectively sentenced to death. Some were rescued by slave dealers who saw profit in raising them for sale. But this rescue came at the price of lifelong bondage. Others were taken by desperate families who needed children for dangerous labor, but had no intention of providing genuine care. The psychological trauma was as devastating as the physical hardships. Roman culture placed enormous emphasis on family honor, ancestral glory, and inherited dignity. To be an orphan was to be cut off from the very source of Roman identity. These children grew up knowing they were sin-stirp, without lineage. In a society that measured human worth by bloodline and family achievement. Imagine the profound loneliness of a child who could not answer the most basic Roman question: who is your father? In a culture where introductions began with family pedigree, where business relationships depended on ancestral reputation, where marriage prospects were determined by lineage, an orphan was permanently marked as inferior, suspect, and ultimately expendable. The winter months brought particular agony. Rome's Mediterranean climate was milder than northern Europe, but winter still brought cold rains, bitter winds, and shortened days. Orphan children, with no heated homes to retreat to, huddled in doorways and under bridges, their thin bodies racked with coughing that would develop into pneumonia. Many never saw another spring. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman orphanhood was how thoroughly society had rationalized this cruelty. Philosophers spoke of the natural order, where the weak perished and the strong survived. Religious leaders proclaimed that the gods determined every child's fate. Legal scholars argued that protecting orphans would undermine the sacred authority of the pater familias. Even Christians, who preached love and charity, often viewed orphaned children as evidence of divine punishment for ancestral sins. This was the world that awaited any child unlucky enough to lose their parents in ancient Rome, a world where compassion was scarce, protection was non-existent, and hope was a luxury they could not afford. It was a fate so terrible that even hardened Roman soldiers, witnessing the aftermath of plague or war, would whisper prayers of gratitude that their own children were safely sheltered. Tonight, as you rest in warmth and security, remember these forgotten children. Their suffering was real, their fear was justified, and their courage in facing each day was perhaps the greatest heroism the ancient world ever witnessed. Close your eyes now and let me guide you backward through time, past the electric lights and heated homes of our modern world, past the comfortable certainties of childhood protection that we take for granted today. Feel the cool night air change around you as we step into the pre-dawn darkness of ancient Rome, circa 150 CE, during the reign of Antoninus Pius. You are 8 years old, and you are awakening not in a warm bed with soft pillows, but on a pile of rags in the corner of a crumbling apartment building in the Subura, Rome's most notorious slum district. The walls around you are thin wood and cracked plaster, and you can hear the restless stirring of dozens of other inhabitants, laborers, prostitutes, freed slaves, and other children like yourself who exist in the shadowy margins of Roman society. The smell hits you first as consciousness returns, the acrid stench of human waste from the overflowing latrines, mixed with the greasy smoke of countless oil lamps and cooking fires, the sour smell of unwashed bodies, and underneath it all, the sweet, cloying odor of decay that seems to permeate every corner of the Subura. Your small hands instinctively pull your thin woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, but it provides little warmth against the damp chill that seeps up from the stone floor. Your stomach clenches with familiar hunger pangs, sharp, gnawing reminders that you haven't eaten since yesterday morning. When you manage to steal a handful of figs from a market stall, the vendor caught you, of course, and his stick left fresh bruises on your back and shoulders. But the brief satisfaction of food in your belly almost made the beating worthwhile. Almost as pale light begins to filter through the single small window, you can see your reflection in a puddle of water that has seeped through the ceiling. The face staring back is gaunt, with prominent cheekbones and dark circles under eyes that have seen too much for 8 years. Your hair, once perhaps a rich brown, is now dull and matted, cut short in uneven chunks with a dull knife to discourage lice. Your skin bears the permanent grime of street life, dirt ground, so deeply into your pores that even the rare opportunity to bathe in the public fountains cannot wash it away. Your clothing tells the story of your life better than any words could. The tunic you wear was once white, perhaps even belonged to a child from a respectable family, but now it hangs on your small frame in faded, patched tatters. The fabric is coarse and scratchy against your skin, with holes at the elbows and a long tear down one side, that you've tried to mend with scraps of cloths scavenged from various sources. Your sandals, if you can call them that, are held together with strips of leather and cord, their soles worn so thin that every pebble on the Roman streets presses painfully into your feet. Around your neck, perhaps the only item of any personal value, hangs a small clay amulet, not valuable enough for anyone to steal, but precious to you because it was your mother's. You remember her face only in fragments now, gentle hands smoothing your hair, a voice humming softly in the darkness, the scent of herbs she gathered to sell in the marketplace. The fever took her 2 years ago, during the terrible summer plague that swept through the Subura like wildfire. Your father, if he was truly your father, for such things were often uncertain among the poor, disappeared one day and never returned. Perhaps he died, perhaps he fled. Perhaps he simply decided that feeding himself was challenging enough without worrying about a child. The sounds of the awakening city filter up from the streets below, the rumble of cartwheels on stone, the calls of early vendors setting up their stalls, the harsh voices of landlords demanding rent from tenants who have nothing to give. You know this symphony of urban life by heart, and you know to that It signals the beginning of another day in your endless struggle to survive. Your bare feet touch the cold floor as you rise, muscles stiff from sleeping on stone. Every movement sends small aches through your undernourished body. The growth that should come naturally to a child your age has been stunted by hunger and hardship. You are smaller than you should be, thinner than is healthy, with the peculiar aged look that suffering brings to young faces. But your eyes burn with an intelligence and awareness that speaks to the incredible adaptability of the human spirit. You have learned to read the subtle signs that mean the difference between life and death, which merchants are generous enough to drop scraps, which guards can be avoided, which wealthy Romans might be persuaded to part with a few coins in exchange for running messages or holding their horses. You have developed instincts sharper than those of many adults, because failure to notice danger could mean starvation, beating, or worse. As you prepare to face another day, you wrap your cloak around your shoulders and step carefully over the sleeping forms of your fellow outcasts. Some are children like yourself, abandoned, orphaned, or simply unwanted. Others are adults broken by life, refugees from failed harvests or business ventures. Former slaves who bought their freedom only to discover that freedom without resources was often worse than bondage. The wooden steps creak under your feet as you make your way down to street level. The morning air is sharp and cold, carrying with it the mixed aromas of baking bread from the wealthy districts and the acrid smoke from the poorer quarters. Above you, the sky is beginning to lighten from black to deep purple, and in the distance you can see the majestic silhouette of the Palatine Hill, where the emperor sleeps in luxury beyond your imagination. This is your world, a world where each day begins with the same questions. Where will you find food? Where will you find shelter? How will you avoid the dangers that lurk around every corner? How will you make it through another day in a city that views you as less than human? And yet, as you step into the bustling street, there is something in your bearing that speaks not of defeat, but of determination. You are a survivor, forged by hardships that would break adults. You carry within you the hopes and dreams that no amount of suffering can entirely extinguish. Today, like every day, you will fight to live, to endure, to find whatever small moments of joy or comfort exist in your harsh world. The city is waking up around you, and your day, your battle, is about to begin. As the morning sun climbs higher over the 7 hills of Rome, painting the marble columns and terracotta roofs in golden light, let us pause in our orphan child's journey to understand the vast historical forces that created such widespread abandonment and suffering. For this was not merely personal tragedy, it was the inevitable result of an empire that had grown so large, so complex, and so focused on conquest and control that it had lost sight of its most vulnerable citizens. You must understand that the Rome of the 2nd century CE was a civilization in the full glory of its power, but also a society straining under contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. The Emperor Antoninus Pius ruled over a territory that stretched from the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. This was the Pax Romana in its golden age, when Roman law, Roman engineering, and Roman culture dominated the known world. Yet this magnificent empire was built upon a foundation of systematic inequality that would shock even the most callous observer today. At the very top of Roman society sat the emperor and his family, surrounded by the senatorial class, ancient families whose wealth was measured in vast estates, worked by thousands of slaves. Below them came the equites, the merchant and business class, followed by ordinary citizens, then freedmen, and finally, At the bottom of the social pyramid, the slaves, who comprised nearly a third of the population. But there was another category, almost invisible in official records, yet numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Those who existed outside this carefully structured hierarchy, the sign, civitate, the non-citizens, the sign, nomen, the nameless ones. And among these forgotten masses, the orphaned children represented perhaps the most tragic element of all. The Roman economy, for all its sophistication, was fundamentally unstable for those at the bottom. While wealthy senators enjoyed incomes equivalent to millions of dollars in today's currency, ordinary laborers survived on wages that barely provided basic sustenance. The famous Roman welfare system, the grain dole and public entertainments, was designed primarily to prevent riots among the urban poor, not to address their underlying needs. And children, who produced no immediate economic value, were considered a luxury that the poor could ill afford. Disease was perhaps the single greatest creator of orphans in the Roman world. The ancient sources speak casually of plagues that would sweep through the city every few years, carrying off thousands of victims. The Antonine Plague, which began just a decade after our story's setting, would eventually kill an estimated 5 million people across the empire. But even in peaceful times, childhood mortality was staggering. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria were constant companions of urban life, particularly in the crowded tenements of the Subura, where our young protagonist lives. The Roman approach to medicine, while advanced for its time, was primitive by modern standards and largely inaccessible to the poor. Wealthy families could afford trained physicians, many of whom were educated Greek slaves with genuine medical knowledge. The poor relied on folk remedies, quack cures, and prayers to the gods. When parents fell ill, children often watched helplessly as their protectors wasted away. Understanding neither the cause of the sickness nor how to prevent its spread, war, too, created orphans on a massive scale. The Roman military machine was constantly in motion, defending frontiers, suppressing rebellions, and conquering new territories. Soldiers served for decades, often dying far from home in campaigns that benefited the empire but destroyed their families. The wives and children left behind frequently faced poverty that could lead to abandonment, prostitution, or starvation. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the Roman practice of infanticide and child abandonment, which was not only legal but socially accepted. Roman law gave the paterfamilias absolute authority over his children, including the right to accept or reject newborns. Unwanted babies, particularly girls, who were considered economically burdensome, were routinely exposed at crossroads or dumped in the Tiber River. Those who survived this initial rejection often became the street children who populate our story. The legal system itself created additional hardships for orphans. Roman citizenship was not a birthright but a privilege, often dependent on legitimate birth within a recognized marriage. Children of slaves, foreigners, or irregular unions had no legal protection whatsoever. Even citizen children, once orphaned, could lose their status if they could not prove their parentage. Without citizenship, a child had no right to the grain dole, no access to Roman courts for protection, and no hope of advancement through military or civilian careers. Religious practices, rather than providing comfort, often added to orphan suffering. While Romans worshipped many gods, their religious system was highly transactional. You performed the proper rituals and sacrifices, and the gods protected you in return. Poor children, unable to afford sacrifices or even basic offerings, were often viewed as having been abandoned by the divine as well as the human community. Christianity was beginning to spread through the empire during this period. But it would be centuries before Christian charity would develop institutions specifically designed to care for orphaned children. The architectural glory that we associate with ancient Rome, the Forum, the Colosseum, the magnificent temples and public buildings, was created by this same system that abandoned children to starvation. The marble that gleamed in the Mediterranean sun was quarried by slaves, transported by laborers earning subsistence wages, and carved by craftsmen whose own children might well end up begging in the streets. The contrast between public magnificence and private misery was one of the defining characteristics of Roman civilization. Education, which might have provided a path out of poverty, was reserved for the children of citizens who could afford to pay teachers. The famous Roman schools trained future lawyers, politicians, and administrators, but their doors were firmly closed to orphans and the poor. Literacy was a privilege, not a right, and the vast majority of our forgotten children would live and die unable to read the inscriptions that covered their city's monuments. Even the entertainment that distracted Romans from their daily struggles reflected and reinforced social inequality. The gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances were funded by wealthy patrons seeking to build political support. The crowds that filled the Colosseum included citizens enjoying free entertainment, but also slaves forced to attend their masters, and countless children who survived by picking pockets, selling small items, or performing in the streets for coins. This was the world that shaped our orphan child's existence, a world of stunning achievement built upon systematic exclusion, magnificent public works funded by private suffering, and social systems designed to maintain order rather than protect the vulnerable. The empire's grandeur cast a shadow so deep that millions of children grew up in perpetual darkness, forgotten by history until tonight, when we remember them in the gentleness of our modern comfort. As you listen to these words, perhaps beginning to feel sleepy in your warm bed, consider how radically different your childhood was from theirs. The legal protections, social services, educational opportunities, and medical care that surround modern children would seem like magic to a Roman orphan. Our society, for all its flaws, has learned lessons written in the tears of those ancient children. Tomorrow's sun will rise on a world where childhood is protected, where orphans have advocates, where no child need face the streets alone. But tonight, in the space between wakefulness and sleep, we honor those who came before, who survived against impossible odds, who carried forward the spark of human dignity even in the darkest circumstances. Their courage lights our way across the centuries. Let us descend deeper now into the shadows of Roman orphan life, into those corners of existence where pain became as constant as breathing, where each dawn brought not hope but merely another day to endure. For to truly understand the magnitude of these children's suffering, we must not flinch from examining the cruelest aspects of their existence, the moments when even the strongest spirit might break under the weight of abandonment and despair. Picture our young protagonist as winter tightens its grip on Rome. The Mediterranean climate, while milder than northern Europe, still brought months of cold rain, bitter winds that howled through the narrow streets of the Subura, and short days that seemed to compress suffering into endless hours of darkness. For a child with no permanent shelter, no warm clothing, and no reliable source of food, winter was not merely uncomfortable, it was a season-long battle against death. The hunger that gnawed at orphan children was not the temporary discomfort we might experience between meals, but a constant, grinding presence that affected every aspect of existence. Their small bodies, already weakened by malnutrition, began to consume themselves, muscle wasting away until bones protruded sharply through paper-thin skin. The bloated bellies we associate with starvation became common sights in Rome's poorest districts, as children's bodies retained water in a desperate attempt to maintain basic functions. But physical hunger was accompanied by something even more devastating: the psychological torment of watching others eat while you starved. Every day, our orphan child would witness the casual abundance of Roman food culture: vendors selling roasted meats and fresh bread, wealthy citizens enjoying elaborate meals in public, slaves carrying baskets full of delicacies to their masters' homes. The contrast was not merely observed but smelled, heard, and felt with agonizing intensity. Imagine the particular cruelty of being a starving child during one of Rome's frequent public banquets or religious festivals. The wealthy would sponsor enormous feasts to curry political favor, distributing food to citizens while orphans pressed their faces against the barriers, watching others gorge themselves on delicacies they could not even name. The psychological impact of such exclusion, being literally fenced out from abundance, created wounds that went far deeper than physical hunger. Disease struck orphan children with a special severity, their weakened immune systems unable to fight off the infections that circulated constantly through Rome's crowded slums. A simple cold could develop into pneumonia, a small cut could become a life-threatening infection, and childhood illnesses like measles or whooping cough were often fatal. But perhaps worse than acute illness was the slow deterioration caused by chronic conditions: the persistent cough from breathing polluted air, the joint pain from sleeping on cold stones, the gradual loss of vision from nutritional deficiencies. The psychological trauma of watching their own bodies fail was compounded by the complete absence of medical care. While wealthy Romans enjoyed the services of trained physicians, orphan children had no one to ease their suffering or explain what was happening to them. They faced illness and injury alone, often in locations where their cries for help would go unheard or ignored. Sexual abuse was a constant threat for children living on the streets, particularly as they grew older and became more visible to predators. Roman society had few legal protections against the sexual exploitation of children, especially those without family protection. Orphan girls faced the additional horror of forced prostitution, often beginning when they were barely past childhood. The famous Roman brothels, while regulated and taxed, relied heavily on a supply of desperate young people who had no other means of survival. Even orphan boys were not safe from sexual exploitation. Roman culture tolerated and even encouraged certain forms of pederasty, particularly relationships between older men and adolescent boys. For orphans, who had no family to protect their honor or seek vengeance for abuse, such exploitation was both more likely and more difficult to escape. The psychological damage was compounded by the social stigma. Attached to being a victim, Roman culture often blamed the abused rather than the abuser. The violence that surrounded orphan children was both random and systematic. Random violence came from desperate adults competing for the same scraps of survival, from drunken citizens amusing themselves by tormenting street children, from guards and officials who saw orphans as inherently criminal and deserving of punishment. But systematic violence was even more crushing: the deliberate cruelty of a society that had decided these children were expendable. Landlords would beat orphan children who sought shelter in doorways or abandoned buildings. Merchants would have them whipped for the crime of looking hungry near food stalls. Citizens would strike them simply for existing in public spaces where their poverty was visible and disturbing to more fortunate observers. The accumulated effect of this constant brutality was to teach orphan children that they deserved suffering, that their very existence was somehow wrong. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the psychological warfare waged against orphan children's sense of self-worth. Roman culture placed enormous emphasis on family honor, ancestral achievement, and inherited dignity. Orphan children grew up bombarded with messages that their lack of family made them inherently inferior, morally suspect, and socially worthless. They internalized shame about circumstances completely beyond their control, developing the self-hatred that society projected onto them. The isolation was as devastating as any physical hardship. Human beings are social creatures, and children especially need connection, approval, and love to develop properly. Orphan children were systematically excluded from the normal social networks that sustained Roman life. They could not participate in family religious observances, neighborhood celebrations, or the informal systems of mutual support that helped other Romans survive hardship. Even relationships between orphan children themselves were complicated by the harsh realities of survival. Trust became a luxury they could not afford when today's friend might steal tomorrow's only meal. Older orphans often exploited younger ones, creating hierarchies of abuse that mirrored the larger society's treatment of the powerless. The very relationships that might have provided emotional sustenance became sources of additional trauma and betrayal. Sleep, which should have offered respite from daily suffering, brought its own terrors. Orphan children slept in doorways, under bridges, in abandoned buildings, or in the corners of overcrowded tenements, always vulnerable to theft, assault, or simply being trampled by others seeking the same precarious shelter. They learned to sleep lightly, to keep their few possessions clutched against their bodies, to wake at the slightest sound that might signal danger. Dreams, when they came, were often crueler than waking reality. Orphan children would dream of their lost parents, of warm homes that no longer existed, of food and safety and love. Waking from such dreams to the harsh reality of the streets added another layer of daily heartbreak, as each dawn brought the fresh pain of remembering their losses. The winter nights were particularly brutal, when Roman temperatures dropped just enough to make outdoor sleeping dangerous. Orphan children would huddle together for warmth, sharing body heat and threadbare blankets, but still many would not survive until spring. Their small bodies, already weakened by malnutrition and disease, simply could not generate enough heat to keep vital organs functioning through the long, cold hours of darkness. Yet perhaps the most insidious form of suffering was the gradual erosion of hope itself. As days turned to months and months to years, as every attempt to improve their circumstances met with failure or punishment, many orphan children developed what we might recognize today as severe depression. They stopped trying to seek help, stopped believing that life could be different, stopped imagining futures beyond mere survival. This spiritual death, the extinguishing of dreams and aspirations, was perhaps the Roman Empire's cruelest achievement. It created a permanent underclass of people who had been taught to accept suffering as their natural state, who had learned to expect nothing from life beyond pain and abandonment. But even in these darkest moments, even when hope seemed completely extinguished, something in the human spirit refused to surrender entirely. Tomorrow, we will speak of those small acts of resilience, those moments when even the most broken children found ways to create meaning, beauty, and connection in their harsh world. Tonight, though, let us simply acknowledge their suffering. Let us honor the tears they shed in solitude, the hunger they bore in silence, the terror they faced alone. Their pain was real, their fear was justified, and their courage in continuing to live, day after day, was perhaps the greatest heroism the ancient world ever witnessed. As you drift toward sleep tonight, held safe by the protections our modern world provides, Remember these forgotten children. Their suffering helped teach humanity lessons about compassion, about the value of every human life, about the moral obligation to protect the vulnerable. Their pain was not meaningless. It was the price humanity paid to learn how to build more just and caring societies. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you might dream of them finding peace at last. In the gentle darkness of this night, as the distant echoes of ancient Rome grow softer and more dreamlike, let me share with you the stories of individual children whose names have been lost to history, but whose experiences illuminate the broader tragedy of Roman orphanhood. These are not documented accounts. The poor and powerless rarely appear in historical records, but rather carefully imagined portraits based on the fragments of evidence that survive, in the spaces between official histories, in the silences left by chroniclers who recorded only the deeds of the powerful. These human stories whisper to us across the centuries. Gaius, the forgotten. There was once a boy named Gaius, or at least, that was the name his mother whispered to him before the fever took her. He was perhaps 9 years old when we might have encountered him in the shadow of the Circus Maximus. His small hands blackened with charcoal as he scratched crude drawings on discarded pottery shards. Before the plague claimed his family, Gaius had lived in a modest apartment above his father's bakery, where he learned to read simple words and numbers, where his mother sang lullabies in the dialect of their native Gaul. The bakery had been in his family for 3 generations, built by his great-grandfather who came to Rome as a slave and eventually bought his freedom through years of grinding labor. The shop's success was modest but steady, enough to feed the family, to maintain their small apartment, to dream of expansion. Gaius remembered the warm smell of baking bread, the comfortable routine of helping his father measure flour and tend the ovens, the pride in his parents' voices when customers praised their work. But in a single terrible summer, disease swept through their neighborhood like wildfire through dry grass. His father fell first, his strong hands too weak to knead dough, his lungs filling with fluid until each breath became a struggle. His mother fought the fever for weeks, caring for her husband and son even as her own strength ebbed away. Gaius watched helplessly as the 2 people who defined his world wasted away before his eyes, leaving him alone with debts he could not pay and skills too undeveloped to earn a living. The bakery was seized by creditors within days of his mother's death. The apartment that had sheltered 3 generations of his family was rented to strangers. Gaius found himself on the streets with nothing but the clothes he wore and a small wooden toy horse his father had carved for him, a treasure he guarded more carefully than life itself because it was all he had left of love. Now he survived by drawing pictures for coins, his childhood training in letters and numbers making him more valuable than completely illiterate street children. He could write simple messages for the barely literate, calculate sums for small transactions, read public notices aloud for those who needed to understand official proclamations. But the competition was fierce. Every skill that might earn a copper coin was practiced by dozens of other desperate children. On cold nights, he would clutch his wooden horse and whisper the Gaulish lullabies his mother had sung, the melody becoming fainter in his memory with each passing month. He tried to keep alive the dream of somehow reclaiming his family's bakery, but as seasons passed and his situation grew more desperate, even that hope began to fade like smoke in the wind. Claudia the silent in the women's quarter of a once grand villa that had been subdivided into tiny rental rooms. There lived a girl of perhaps 11 who rarely spoke above a whisper. Her neighbors called her Claudia, though whether that was her true name or simply what someone had decided to call her, no one remembered. She had been found as a toddler, abandoned in the temple of Juno. with no identifying marks except a crude tattoo on her shoulder that suggested she had been born to a slave mother. The temple priests, following custom, had given her to a family willing to raise her in exchange for her future labor. But that family had fallen on hard times and sold her to a wool merchant who needed small fingers for intricate weaving work. When the merchant died, his widow kept Claudia as general household labor, cooking, cleaning, caring for the younger children, all in exchange for a corner to sleep in and scraps from the family meals. Claudia possessed an extraordinary gift for working with textiles. Her fingers seemed to understand the language of threads and fibers with an intuitive skill that amazed even experienced weavers. She could create patterns of stunning complexity, could repair damaged fabrics so skillfully that the mends were invisible, could transform raw wool into cloth that was both functional and beautiful. In a different world, with different circumstances, she might have become a renowned artisan, her work adorning the homes of senators and merchants. But gifts meant little without freedom to develop them. Claudia's days were filled with menial tasks that left her exhausted and her extraordinary talent unused except for the family's basic needs. She dreamed of having her own loom, of creating beautiful things for their own sake, rather than merely for survival. Sometimes, late at night, when the household slept, she would practice patterns in the air with her fingers, weaving invisible tapestries that told stories of loss and hope. The silence that gave her her nickname had not always defined her. As a small child, she had been chatty and curious, full of questions about the world around her. But years of being told that her words didn't matter, that her thoughts were unimportant, that her only value lay in her labor, had gradually stolen her voice. She learned that speaking drew attention, and attention from those in power rarely brought anything good. Yet, in her silence, Claudia observed everything. She noticed which merchants were honest and which cheated their customers. She saw which neighbors were kind to children and which were cruel. She understood the subtle dynamics of power and fear that governed her small corner of the Roman world. Her silence became a form of protection, but also a prison that separated her from human connection. When the family's fortunes declined further and they could no longer afford to feed her, Claudia found herself truly alone for the first time in her remembered life. She carried with her only a small bundle of threads, scraps she had saved over the years, and the muscle memory of textile work. But without access to materials or tools, even her extraordinary skills could not provide salvation. Marcus the Dreamer there was a boy who had once been called Marcus Aurelius, not after the emperor, but after a grandfather who had served with distinction in the legions and earned citizen status for his family. This boy, perhaps 12 years old, had inherited more than a name from his grandfather. He possessed a remarkable memory and a gift for storytelling that could hold listeners spellbound for hours. Before tragedy struck, Marcus had lived with his grandparents in a modest but respectable home near the Campus Martis. His grandfather, despite being unable to read, had an encyclopedic knowledge of military history, epic poetry, and Roman legend. Every evening, the old soldier would regale his grandson with tales of battles fought and heroes made, of gods walking among mortals, of the great deeds that had built the empire. Marcus absorbed these stories like parched earth absorbing rain. He could recite entire passages of the Aeneid from memory, could tell the complete history of the Punic Wars with perfect accuracy, could weave together myths and legends into new tales that seemed to dance with life. His grandfather predicted a great future for the boy, perhaps as a teacher or even as a court storyteller for wealthy patrons. But when plague took both grandparents within a week of each other, Marcus found that his extraordinary gift was nearly worthless on the streets of Rome. The wealthy already had educated slaves to entertain them with stories and poetry. The poor were too focused on survival to spare coins for entertainment. His beautiful voice and perfect memory, treasures in a stable household, became luxuries no one could afford to value. He tried performing in the streets, hoping to earn coins by reciting popular stories or composing impromptu tales for passers-by. Sometimes he succeeded, drawing small crowds who would listen with delight to his performances. But street performance was precarious work. What pleased an audience one day might offend officials the next. An unlicensed entertainment could be considered a public disturbance, punishable by beating or imprisonment. Gradually, Marcus learned to ration his stories, to save them for the moments when they might mean the difference between eating and starving. He discovered that other orphan children would sometimes share food in exchange for tales that helped them forget their hunger and fear. In the darkest corners of Roman society, he created small communities of listeners who found in his words brief escapes from their harsh reality. But as months passed and malnutrition began to affect his memory, Marcus watched in horror as his greatest treasure, his vast store of stories, began to slip away like water through cupped hands. Names of heroes became confused. The details of great battles grew hazy. Entire epic poems dissolved into fragments. He was losing not just his livelihood, but his very identity, piece by precious piece. Anna, the invisible in the household of a minor senator, lived a girl whose existence was so precarious that even her name seemed uncertain. Some called her Anna, others simply the girl, and many acted as though she wasn't there at all. She had been brought to the house as an infant, found by the senator's wife among the offerings left at a temple shrine. Moved by momentary compassion, the woman had brought the baby home. But that initial kindness had quickly faded into indifference. Anna existed in a strange liminal space. Not quite slave, not quite family member, not quite servant. She had no official status, no legal protection, no defined role. She survived by making herself useful in whatever way seemed least likely to draw negative attention. Tidying rooms without being asked, helping in the kitchen without getting in the way, caring for the senator's legitimate children while remaining invisible to their parents. The senator's household was prosperous but not wealthy, respectable but not influential. They could not afford many slaves, but they resented having to acknowledge Anna's presence or define her position. She became a ghost in their home, fed with scraps, clothed in cast-offs, housed in storage spaces, acknowledged only when something went wrong and they needed someone to blame. Anna developed extraordinary skills in observation and anticipation. She could sense the household's moods before they erupted into conflict, could predict which family members would be angry or generous on any given day, could navigate the complex web of relationships and rivalries that defined domestic life. Her survival depended on being needed but not noticed, helpful but not demanding. As she grew older, Anna's ambiguous status became more problematic. The senator's wife saw her as a potential threat, a pretty girl in the household who might seduce her husband or sons. The senator himself began to view her with uncomfortable interest that made Anna instinctively seek shadows and corners. The legitimate children treated her sometimes as a sibling, sometimes as a servant, creating emotional confusion that left her never certain where she stood. When political reversals reduced the family's fortunes, Anna was the first casualty. She was quietly dismissed from the household one morning with no explanation, no resources, and no preparation for life outside the only home she remembered. At 14, she found herself on the Roman streets with fewer survival skills than children who had grown up there. her years of protective invisibility having left her unprepared for the harsh visibility of homelessness. The nameless twins, in the most crowded section of the Subura. There lived 2 children who might have been twins, a boy and girl of perhaps 10 years, whose resemblance suggested they were siblings, though neither could remember their origins clearly enough to be certain. They had survived on the streets for so long that their original names had been forgotten, replaced by nicknames that changed depending on who was speaking. The quick ones, the shadow children, the thieves. Though theft was merely one of many survival strategies they employed, their bond was perhaps the strongest human connection in their corner of the Roman world. They had learned to function as a single unit, communicating through glances and gestures, dividing tasks instinctively, protecting each other with fierce loyalty. The boy was slightly larger and stronger, better at tasks requiring physical courage. The girl was quicker and more observant, better at reading people and situations. Together, they had developed an elaborate system of survival that depended on their seeming to be a single, harmless child to casual observers. One would create a distraction, while the other completed whatever task was necessary, gathering food, finding shelter, avoiding danger. They had become expert at melting into crowds, at appearing and disappearing like smoke, at being present but unnoticed. Their greatest fear was separation. They had seen other street children torn apart by circumstance, one taken by slavers while the other escaped, one falling ill while the other remained healthy, one growing larger while the other stayed small. They clung to each other with desperate intensity, understanding instinctively that their survival depended not just on their individual skills but on their partnership. But as they grew older, the challenges of maintaining their bond multiplied. The girl was beginning to develop physical characteristics that drew unwanted attention from adult men. The boy's growth was being stunted by malnutrition, making him appear younger than his years while she seemed older. The dynamic that had protected them as small children was becoming a source of vulnerability. They had developed their own private language, a mixture of street Latin, fragments of other languages overheard from foreign merchants, and invented words that held meaning only for them. In this secret tongue, they shared dreams of finding a place where they could be safe together, where their bond would be seen as strength rather than strange dependency. Lucia the learned, perhaps the most tragic figure of all, was a girl of 13 who had once been called Lucia, daughter of a respected scribe who worked in the imperial bureaucracy. She had been raised in a household where learning was valued, where scrolls and wax tablets were common tools, where discussion of philosophy and literature accompanied evening meals. Her father had taught her to read and write in both Latin and Greek, unusual accomplishments for any Roman girl, but especially remarkable for one from a middle-class family. Lucia's world had been one of intellectual curiosity and gentle privilege. She had spent her mornings learning letters and numbers, her afternoons helping her father organize documents and correspondence, her evenings listening to him read aloud from works of poetry and history. She had dreamed of perhaps becoming a teacher herself, or of marrying a man who would value her education and allow her to continue learning. But her father's position in the bureaucracy, while respectable, was also precarious. When political changes brought new officials to power, many of the previous administration's employees were dismissed or transferred. Lucia's father, unable to adapt to the new system's demands, lost his position and fell into the kind of desperate poverty that claimed lives as surely as any disease. The family's decline was swift and brutal. First went their comfortable apartment, then their furniture and personal possessions, then their food and clothing. Lucia watched her educated, dignified father reduced to begging in the streets where he had once walked with professional pride. when shame and despair finally killed him. She found herself alone with skills that seemed worthless in her new circumstances. Literacy, which had once been her greatest treasure, became almost a curse on the streets. She could read the inscriptions on public buildings that proclaimed the glory of Rome, while she starved in their shadows. She could calculate sums and compose letters, but no one needed such services from a homeless girl. Her education served mainly to make her more aware of her fall from grace, more conscious of the contrast between her former life and her current degradation. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Lucia would scratch letters in the dirt with a stick, writing out passages from memory or composing new thoughts in the language she still loved. But even these small acts of intellectual comfort carried danger. Literacy marked her as different from other street children, potentially making her a target for those who resented any suggestion of superiority. These individual stories, imagined but rooted in historical reality, remind us that behind every statistic of suffering were human faces, beating hearts, minds capable of dreams and fears and love. Each orphan child in ancient Rome was not merely a victim, but a complete person, with gifts and talents, memories and hopes, relationships and inner lives that deserved protection and nurturing. As you begin to feel sleep approaching, as your own comfortable bed beckons and your eyelids grow heavy, carry these children with you into your dreams. Let their stories remind you that every human life has infinite value, that every child deserves safety and love, that the cruelties of the past teach us to cherish and protect the vulnerabilities of the present. Tomorrow, when you wake in your secure world, their imagined voices might whisper to you about gratitude, about the preciousness of the protections we now take for granted, about the responsibility we all share to ensure that no child faces the world alone and afraid. Sleep now, and let their courage inspire your dreams. Even in the deepest shadows of ancient Roman cruelty, even in the most desperate corners of orphan existence, the human spirit occasionally flickered with unexpected warmth. Tonight, as we continue our gentle journey through these difficult memories, let us seek out those rare moments when compassion pierced the darkness, when community formed among the forgotten, when hope proved stronger than despair. These glimpses of light do not diminish the reality of suffering we have explored, but they remind us that humanity's capacity for kindness has always existed alongside its capacity for cruelty. The baker's daily bread in a narrow street not far from the Forum. There stood a small bakery run by an elderly man named Quintus Flavius. He had been a slave once, purchased as a young boy to work in his master's kitchen, but had eventually earned his freedom through skill and loyalty. Now, in his 60th year, with gnarled hands that still moved with sure precision when kneading dough, he had developed a habit that his neighbors thought either saintly or foolish. Every evening, as he closed his shop, Quintus would gather the day's unsold bread, loaves that were still perfectly edible, but would be stale by morning, and place them in a large basket by his door. Word had spread among the street children that these loaves would remain there until dawn, free for any hungry child to take. He never made a show of this charity, never demanded gratitude or even acknowledgement. The bread simply appeared each night like a small miracle. For orphan children who had learned to expect nothing from adults except indifference or hostility, Quintus's breadbasket represented something almost incomprehensible: kindness without conditions, generosity without strings attached. They would approach cautiously at first, certain this must be some kind of trap. But night after night, the bread appeared, and no one demanded payment or punishment in return. Some of the children began to linger near the bakery during the day, drawn by the warm smells of baking and the unprecedented experience of being tolerated by an adult. Quintus, busy with his customers and work, would occasionally nod to them or even smile. He never shooed them away as long as they caused no trouble, and sometimes, when a loaf fell on the floor or a batch came out slightly imperfect, he would wordlessly hand it to whichever child was nearest. The old baker never spoke of his motivations, but observant children noticed the small shrine in his shop's corner, dedicated not to the usual Roman gods, but to a foreign deity, perhaps Mithras, or one of the mystery cults that promised salvation to slaves and the downtrodden. His own memories of childhood bondage, of hunger and fear and powerlessness, had taught him that small acts of kindness could mean the difference between hope and despair. The gladiator's secret. In the gladiatorial schools near the Colosseum lived a fighter known as Ferox the Gaul, a man whose scarred body and reputation for savagery in the arena made him feared by spectators and fellow gladiators alike. He had killed dozens of opponents in the sand, had survived longer than most gladiators could hope to live, had earned enough prize money to buy his freedom several times over, but had never chosen to do so. What the crowds didn't know was that Ferox sent nearly every coin he earned to a network of safe houses throughout the city, places where orphaned children could find temporary shelter, basic medical care, and protection from the worst predators that hunted the vulnerable. He had created this network quietly, working with former gladiators who had bought their freedom, sympathetic tavern keepers, and a few priests from various religious cults. The inspiration for this secret charity came from Ferox's own childhood memories. He had been captured as a boy during one of Rome's campaigns in Gaul, had watched his parents killed and his village burned. His survival in the gladiatorial schools had required him to become hard, brutal, apparently unfeeling. But somewhere deep inside, the memory of being a frightened, orphaned child had never died. The safe houses were not luxurious, often just rooms above taverns or in the back of shops, but they offered what was most precious to street children: safety. A child could stay for a few days or weeks without fear of violence or exploitation, could heal from injuries or recover from illness, could simply sleep without constant vigilance. No questions were asked about background or circumstances. The only rules were simple: no violence toward other children, no stealing from hosts, no revealing the locations to dangerous adults. Ferox himself never visited these refuges. His fearsome appearance would have terrified the very children he sought to help. But through intermediaries, he would sometimes hear stories of children who had been helped. A sick girl who recovered from fever, twin brothers who were reunited after being separated, an older boy who found legitimate work after gaining enough strength to be employable. The gladiator's career was brutal and short by design, but his secret network outlasted him. When he finally fell in the arena, pierced by a younger fighter's spear, the system he had created continued operating. Other gladiators, inspired by his example, took up the burden of funding. Former beneficiaries, grown to adulthood, returned to help new generations of orphans. The Christian underground in the decades following our story's setting. A new religious movement was beginning to spread through Rome's poorest districts. These Christians, followers of a Jewish teacher who had been executed for sedition, preached radical ideas about the value of human life, the importance of caring for the vulnerable, and the possibility of salvation for even the lowest members of society. While Christianity would not become a major force in child welfare for several more centuries. Even in these early days, small Christian communities were quietly developing practices that offered hope to orphaned children. They called it agape, selfless love expressed through practical care for those in need. In hidden rooms beneath the city, in private homes, and in the back corners of shops, Christian families would gather children who had nowhere else to go. These were not formal institutions, but informal networks of care, operating carefully to avoid official attention. A Christian baker might take in an orphaned child as a helper. A Christian widow might share her small apartment with several homeless children. A Christian merchant might create jobs that allowed older orphans to earn honest livings. What made these Christian refuges different from other forms of ancient charity was their underlying philosophy. Traditional Roman charity was often conditional, designed to win political favor or demonstrate social status. Christian charity, at its best, was motivated by the belief that every human being was beloved by God. The caring for the vulnerable was not optional generosity, but moral obligation. The children who found their way into Christian households discovered something revolutionary for its time. Adults who treated them as inherently valuable rather than burdensome, who saw potential rather than just problems, who offered love alongside basic necessities. They learned to read using Christian texts, participated in communal meals where they were welcomed as family members, and absorbed values that emphasized human dignity and mutual responsibility. Of course, even Christian charity was limited by the constraints of a hostile society. These communities had to operate in secrecy, their resources were modest, and they could help only a small fraction of Rome's orphaned population. But for the children they did reach, Christianity offered something that had been almost entirely absent from their lives: the experience of being truly loved and valued. The Festival of the Children, once each year, during the early spring festival of Liberalia, a celebration honoring the god Liber and marking the passage of boys into manhood. Something extraordinary would happen in Rome's poorest districts. For just one day, the usual social hierarchies would be temporarily suspended, and even the most despised street children would find themselves included in the city's celebrations. The festival's official purpose was to honor young citizens as they received their adult togas. But in the neighborhoods where few families could afford such ceremonies, the celebration took on a more egalitarian character. Tavern keepers would offer free food to any child, regardless of status. Street performers would include orphan children in their acts. Even some wealthy families, perhaps moved by religious sentiment or simple seasonal goodwill, would distribute gifts to any children they encountered. For orphan children, this single day of inclusion was simultaneously wonderful and heartbreaking. To be treated with kindness, to be offered food without having to beg or steal, to be smiled at instead of cursed. These experiences were so foreign to their daily reality that they seemed like glimpses of another world entirely. Some children would save coins or small gifts received during Liberalia throughout the entire year, treasuring them not for their material value, but as proof that they had once, however briefly, been treated as worthy of kindness. Others would spend weeks preparing for the festival, practicing songs or dances they hoped to perform, dreaming of earning not just coins, but applause and approval. The tragedy, of course, was that this kindness lasted only a single day. When the festival ended, the social barriers would rise again, and orphan children would return to their usual state of invisibility and rejection. But for many, that one day of inclusion provided enough hope to sustain them through months of hardship. The teacher's secret school in a cramped apartment in the Subura. A former slave named Lucius Didius had established something unprecedented in Roman society, a school for children who could not afford education. Lucius had been fortunate enough to serve an educated master who had taught him to read and write as part of his secretarial duties. When he eventually bought his freedom, he had used these skills to earn a modest living as a scribe and record keeper. But Lucius remembered what it felt like to be powerless and dependent, and he had noticed how many intelligent children wandered the streets with no hope of education simply because they lacked family connections and money. In the evenings, after completing his paid work, he would open his small apartment to any child willing to learn. The school was primitive by any standard. Students sat on the floor, wrote on bits of broken pottery with charcoal, and shared a few worn scrolls that Lucius had acquired over the years. But for children who had never held a stylus or seen written words, these lessons represented magic. Lucius taught basic literacy and numeracy, but also something more valuable, the confidence that comes from understanding. Children who learned to read discovered that they could navigate the city more effectively, could understand public notices and shop signs, could even find occasional work as messengers or record keepers. More importantly, they learned that their minds were capable of growth and development. The secret school operated informally and intermittently, sometimes daily lessons, sometimes just a few sessions per week, depending on Lucius's other commitments and the students' availability. Some children attended regularly for months. Others appeared only occasionally when they could spare time from survival activities. But every child who passed through the school carried away something that could never be taken from them, the knowledge that they were capable of learning. Lucius asked nothing in return except attention and effort. He provided not just education, but encouragement, treating each small achievement, a word successfully read, a sum correctly calculated, as worthy of celebration. For children accustomed to constant criticism and failure, this experience of academic success, however modest, could transform their understanding of their own capabilities. The network of the streets, perhaps most remarkable of all, was the informal network of mutual support that developed among orphan children themselves. Despite the harsh competition for resources and the psychological damage caused by their circumstances, many street children found ways to care for each other, creating family-like bonds that provided emotional sustenance in an emotionally barren world. Older children would sometimes adopt younger ones, sharing food and protection in exchange for companionship and help with small tasks. Children with particular skills, those who could read or had connections with sympathetic adults or knew the best places to find food or shelter, would share their knowledge with newcomers to street life. These informal families often developed their own rituals and traditions. They would celebrate birthdays or approximations of birthdays for children who didn't know their exact age, with whatever small treats they could gather. They would tell stories in the evenings, sharing memories of better times, or creating fantasy tales about hypothetical futures. They would develop private jokes, secret languages, and ways of communicating that helped them maintain human connection despite their circumstances. When one child in these informal families became ill, the others would care for them as best they could, sharing warmth, finding softer places to rest, bringing water and any medicine they could obtain. When one found temporary work or a source of regular food, they would share with their chosen family members. When danger threatened, they would protect each other with fierce loyalty. These relationships were not always stable. The stresses of survival could strain even the strongest bonds, but they provided something essential that institutional charity could not offer: genuine human connection based on shared experience and mutual understanding. The children in these informal families knew exactly what their companions had endured, could offer comfort rooted in real empathy, could celebrate small victories with people who understood their true significance. The love that developed in these street families was perhaps more pure than many forms of conventional affection, precisely because it was based on choice rather than obligation, on mutual support rather than dependency. Children who had every reason to become hardened and selfish instead chose to open their hearts to others who needed care. These glimpses of light in the darkness remind us that even in the cruelest circumstances, human beings find ways to create meaning, connection, and hope. The kindness of the baker, the secret generosity of the gladiator, the radical love of early Christians, the joy of festival inclusion, the gift of education, and the fierce loyalty of chosen families. All of these represent the eternal human capacity to resist dehumanization through acts of care and connection. As sleep approaches and these ancient voices grow softer, let their examples of resilience and compassion accompany you into your dreams. Tomorrow, when you wake in your protected world, their courage might inspire you to look for ways to extend kindness to those who need it most. To remember that small acts of care can illuminate even the darkest circumstances. In the space between wakefulness and sleep, these Roman children, forgotten by history but remembered tonight in love, whisper across the centuries that hope, however fragile, can survive even the harshest conditions when human hearts choose to remain open to one another. As our journey through the shadowed streets of ancient Rome draws toward its close, as the voices of those long ago children begin to fade into the gentle mist of approaching sleep, let us pause to reflect on what these painful stories mean for us who live in such different times. What do we learn from walking alongside these forgotten orphans? What wisdom do their tears and courage offer to our modern hearts? How do their struggles illuminate both how far we have traveled as a civilization and how much their ancient pain still echoes in our contemporary world? The distance between their Rome and our world is measured not merely in centuries but in fundamental shifts in human consciousness, changes in how we understand childhood, how we value human life, how we organize society to protect the vulnerable. These orphan children lived in a time when such protection was considered neither necessary nor desirable, when suffering was accepted as natural and inevitable, when the powerful felt no obligation to care for those beneath them in society's rigid hierarchy. Yet as we have walked with them through their daily struggles, we have also discovered something eternal and unchanging about human nature: the capacity for both incredible cruelty and unexpected kindness, the resilience of hope, even in hopeless circumstances, the power of human connection to create meaning in meaningless situations. These Roman orphans, separated from us by 2 millennia, faced emotions and challenges that remain remarkably familiar to anyone who works with vulnerable children today. The architecture of abandonment Roman society created what we might call an architecture of abandonment, legal, social, and economic structures that systematically excluded certain groups of people from protection and support. The patria potestas that gave fathers absolute power over children, the citizenship requirements that determined access to basic services, the economic systems that treated human beings as property, all of these combined to create conditions where abandoning children was not only legal but practically inevitable for many families. This architecture was not accidental or the result of individual cruelty, but rather the logical outcome of a society organized around principles of hierarchy, exclusion, and conditional worth. Roman civilization could create magnificent works of art and engineering, while simultaneously tolerating mass child abandonment because it had never developed the concept that all human beings possess inherent dignity, deserving of protection. When we look at our modern world, we can see both how far we have progressed and how many elements of this architecture of abandonment persist in different forms. We have created legal frameworks that recognize children's rights, social services that provide safety nets for vulnerable families, and educational systems that aim to serve all children regardless of background. These represent genuine moral progress, hard-won victories in humanity's long struggle to expand the circle of care and protection. Yet we also know that millions of children worldwide still face variations of the abandonment that plagued ancient Rome. Children in refugee camps, children in extreme poverty, children aging out of foster care systems, children born into areas ravaged by war or environmental destruction. All of these represent modern echoes of ancient patterns. The specific mechanisms may have changed, but the fundamental dynamic of society creating conditions that abandon certain children while protecting others remains disturbingly familiar. The psychology of survival, the Roman orphans. We have developed psychological strategies that allowed them to survive in hostile environments: hypervigilance, emotional numbing, fierce independence, the ability to find safety in shadows and corners. These adaptations were necessary for survival, but they also came at enormous cost to their emotional and social development. Modern psychology has given us language to understand what these children experienced: complex trauma, developmental disruption, attachment disorders, the long-term effects of chronic stress on developing brains. We now know that children who grow up without stable caregiving relationships often struggle throughout their lives with trust, emotional regulation, and the capacity for intimate connection. This knowledge makes the stories of Roman orphans even more heartbreaking, because we can understand not only what they endured in the moment, but also how their early experiences would have shaped their entire life trajectories. A Roman orphan who survived to adulthood would likely have carried invisible wounds that affected their ability to form families, maintain relationships, and find emotional peace. But this same knowledge also highlights something remarkable about the children we have met: their capacity to maintain hope, to form connections with each other, to find moments of joy and meaning even in terrible circumstances. Their resilience speaks to something fundamental about human nature: our ability to adapt, to find ways of preserving our essential humanity even when the world seems designed to destroy it. The ripple effects of abandonment, the consequences of Rome's systematic abandonment of orphan children, extended far beyond individual suffering. A society that tolerates the mistreatment of its most vulnerable members creates conditions that ultimately undermine everyone's security and well-being. The violence and desperation of the Roman streets affected not just the homeless children, but everyone who lived in or traveled through those areas. When children grow up without stable families, without education, without legitimate opportunities for advancement, they often turn to whatever means of survival are available: theft, prostitution, violence. This creates cycles of crime and social disruption that affect entire communities. Roman society paid a high price for its abandonment of orphan children, not just in terms of moral decay, but in practical problems of urban safety and social stability. The economic costs were equally significant. Each abandoned child represented lost human potential, lost creativity, lost productivity, lost innovation. How many potential inventors, artists, leaders, or simply productive citizens were lost to starvation, disease, or despair on Roman streets? How much did Roman civilization diminish itself by failing to nurture all of its children? These patterns remain relevant today. Modern societies that fail to adequately support vulnerable children often discover that the costs of neglect in terms of crime, social services, lost productivity, and human suffering far exceed the costs of prevention and early intervention. The Roman orphans remind us that abandoning children is not just morally wrong, but practically counterproductive. The power of small kindnesses, yet among the darkest lessons of our journey, are also the brightest. The stories of individuals who chose compassion over indifference, who found ways to extend care even within systems designed to prevent it. The baker who left bread for hungry children, the gladiator who funded secret safe houses, the teacher who provided free education, the Christians who welcomed orphans into their homes. All of these represent the eternal human capacity to resist cruelty through acts of love. These examples are particularly powerful because they show how much difference individual choices can make, even within oppressive systems. These people were not emperors or senators with the power to change laws or social structures. They were ordinary people who chose to use whatever resources and opportunities they had to make life better for vulnerable children. Their stories remind us that we too live within imperfect systems, that we too have opportunities every day to choose compassion over indifference. The specific needs may be different, but the fundamental opportunity to extend care to vulnerable children remains constant across time and culture. The evolution of consciousness, perhaps most importantly. The stories of Roman orphans help us understand how human consciousness has evolved over centuries. The very fact that we find their suffering disturbing represents moral progress. Roman audiences could watch children fight to the death in gladiatorial games as entertainment. We build entire societies around protecting children from such exploitation. This evolution didn't happen automatically or inevitably. It required the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who chose to expand their circle of concern, who recognized the humanity in people previously considered expendable, who built institutions and systems designed to protect rather than exploit the vulnerable. The progression from Roman abandonment to modern child protection was neither linear nor complete, but it represents one of humanity's greatest moral achievements. Every law protecting children's rights, every social service supporting vulnerable families, every educational program designed to reach marginalized children, builds upon lessons learned from tragedies like those we have witnessed tonight. The responsibility of memory as we remember these Roman orphans. We also accept a responsibility to ensure that their suffering was not meaningless, that their pain contributed to humanity's slow progress toward greater compassion and justice. We honor them not through pity but through action, not through guilt but through commitment to protecting today's vulnerable children. Their stories challenge us to examine our own society's blind spots, to ask which groups of children we might be unconsciously abandoning or neglecting. They remind us that every generation believes it has solved the problems of cruelty and abandonment, only to discover new forms of both emerging. The Roman orphans speak to us across the centuries, with voices that demand not just sympathy, but solidarity, a recognition that their struggle continues in different forms, that the work of protecting children requires constant vigilance and commitment, that the capacity for both cruelty and compassion remains present in every human heart and every human society. As sleep approaches and these ancient voices grow softer, let their wisdom settle into your dreams. Let their courage inspire your waking hours. Let their pain remind you of how precious is the protection you enjoy, how valuable is every effort to extend that protection to others. Tomorrow, when you wake in your secure world, you will carry with you the memory of children who faced the darkness with extraordinary bravery, who found ways to love and hope and dream even in the cruelest circumstances, who remind us that every human life has infinite value and every act of kindness creates ripples that extend across centuries. Their long shadow of memory lights our way forward, teaching us that progress is possible but never guaranteed, that compassion must be chosen again and again, that the work of creating a more just world belongs to every generation. In your dreams tonight, perhaps you will dream of a world where no child faces the darkness alone. where every society protects its most vulnerable members, where the lessons learned from ancient tears finally flower into lasting protection for all the world's children. And so, dear weary traveler, our long journey through the cobblestone streets and shadowed alleys of ancient Rome comes to its gentle close. The voices of those forgotten children are growing softer now, fading into the comfortable darkness that surrounds your resting place, becoming whispers that will follow you into sleep like distant lullabies sung across the centuries. Can you feel it, that shift in the air around you as we slowly return from that distant world to this one? The harsh stones of Roman streets gradually give way to your soft bedding. The cold night wind that chilled orphan children transforms into the warmth of your secure shelter. The uncertain darkness that terrified the abandoned becomes the peaceful darkness that invites your rest. Take a deep breath now. Feel your shoulders relax. Let the weight of these ancient sorrows settle not as burden but as blessing, the blessing of understanding, the gift of expanded compassion, the treasure of historical perspective that helps us appreciate how far we have traveled as a species, how much progress we have made in protecting the vulnerable, how precious are the securities we now take for granted. As you prepare to drift into sleep, carry with you not the pain of these Roman children, but their extraordinary courage. Remember not their despair, but their resilience. Honor not their abandonment, but their fierce capacity to find hope in hopeless circumstances, love in loveless situations, meaning in apparently meaningless suffering. Think of young Gaius with his wooden horse, treasuring the last gift of parental love, while learning to survive in a world that saw him as expendable. His story reminds us that even the smallest tokens of affection can sustain a human heart through the longest trials. Tonight, as you rest surrounded by comfort, perhaps you might think of the small gifts of love in your own life, the gestures of care that have shaped you, the moments of tenderness that have sustained you, the connections that have made you who you are. Remember silent Claudia with her extraordinary gift for weaving, finding beauty and creating meaning through her skilled hands even when the world gave her no opportunity to fully develop her talents. Her story speaks to the incredible resilience of human creativity, the way artistic expression can flourish even in the harshest soil. As you close your eyes, perhaps you might reflect on your own creative gifts, the ways you make beauty in the world, the skills that bring you joy, the talents that connect you to something larger than survival. Picture Marcus, the storyteller, whose magnificent memory held entire epics even as malnutrition threatened to steal them away. His dedication to preserving stories reminds us that culture and wisdom survive through individual hearts and minds, that each of us carries forward the accumulated treasures of human experience. Tonight, as sleep approaches, you might think of the stories that have shaped you, the books that opened your mind, the family tales that connected you to your heritage, the narratives that help you make sense of your own life's journey. Think of Invisible Anna, who learned to navigate complex social situations through careful observation and adaptation, whose survival depended on understanding human nature in all its complexity. Her story illuminates the incredible intelligence that can develop under pressure, the sophisticated skills that emerge from necessity. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might appreciate your own hard-won wisdom, the insights you've gained from difficult experiences, the emotional intelligence you've developed through navigating relationships, the strength you've discovered in yourself through facing challenges. Remember the nameless twins, whose fierce loyalty to each other created an island of love in an ocean of abandonment. Their bond reminds us that human connection can flourish even in the most barren circumstances, that love finds a way to survive even when everything else fails. Tonight, surrounded by your own networks of care and support, You might feel grateful for the relationships that sustain you, family members who accept you, friends who understand you, communities that welcome you. Picture learned Lucia, whose education became both blessing and curse as she fell from privilege into poverty. Her story speaks to the double-edged nature of awareness, how knowledge can increase both opportunity and suffering, how understanding can bring both power and pain. As you prepare for sleep, perhaps you might reflect on your own learning journey, the education that has opened doors for you, the knowledge that has enriched your life, the awareness that is complicated but also deepened your experience of being human. And think of all the unnamed, unremembered children whose stories we will never know. The countless orphans who faced each dawn with courage we can barely imagine, who found ways to maintain their humanity despite inhuman circumstances, who carried forward the spark of hope even when every reason for hope seemed extinguished. Their collective voice whispers to us across the centuries with a message both simple and profound, that human beings are capable of surviving almost anything, that the capacity for love and kindness exists even in the cruelest circumstances, that every life has value beyond measure, that progress is possible when people choose compassion over indifference. But tonight is not a night for grand gestures or overwhelming responsibility. Tonight is for gentle gratitude, for soft appreciation, for quiet recognition of how fortunate we are to live in times when childhood is protected, when orphans have advocates, when society has learned, however imperfectly, to value all its members. As you settle deeper into comfort, as your breathing slows and your muscles relax, let these ancient children become your guardians rather than your burden. Let their courage strengthen your own heart. Let their resilience inspire your daily choices. Let their capacity for love remind you of the connections that make life meaningful. The Roman Empire fell, as all empires do. The marble columns crumbled, the mighty legions scattered, the proud senators were forgotten. But the human values that those orphan children embodied: courage in the face of fear, love in the face of abandonment, hope in the face of despair, these endure. These values built the better world you inhabit tonight. The world where children are treasured rather than discarded, where vulnerability is met with protection rather than exploitation. You are the inheritor of their struggles, the beneficiary of lessons learned through their tears. You live in the world their suffering helped create, a world more just, more compassionate, more aware of the preciousness of every human life. This inheritance comes with both privilege and responsibility, but tonight, as sleep calls to you, focus on the privilege. Feel grateful for the safety that surrounds you, the love that sustains you, the opportunities that await you. Close your eyes now, dear listener. Let your mind grow quiet. Feel yourself sinking into the deep rest that those Roman children rarely enjoyed, the peaceful sleep that comes from security they never knew. As consciousness fades, perhaps you might whisper a small prayer of gratitude, not just for your own comfort, but for the progress humanity has made, for the protections we have built, for the wisdom we have gained from ancient sorrows. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself walking through a different kind of ancient Rome, a Rome where children are safe, where orphans are embraced, where love and kindness flow like water through the streets. This dream Rome exists not in the past, but in the future we continue to build. The world we create through our daily choices to extend care rather than withhold it, to include rather than exclude, to protect rather than abandon. The children whose stories we have shared tonight are at peace now, their struggles ended, their courage remembered. They have become teachers across time, guides who show us both how far we have come and how precious is the journey toward greater compassion. Their voices join the vast chorus of human experience that whispers to us in sleep, reminding us that every act of kindness matters. Every moment of love endures. Every choice for compassion helps build a better world. Sleep well, gentle dreamer. Rest in the security they helped make possible. Dream of the world their courage inspired. And when you wake tomorrow, refreshed and restored, carry their memory with you, not as sadness, but as strength, not as burden, but as blessing, not as reason for despair, but as inspiration for hope. Thank you for joining me on this journey through shadows and starlight, through ancient sorrows and eternal hopes. Thank you for honoring these forgotten children with your attention, your empathy, your willingness to learn from their pain. Thank you for carrying their stories into your dreams and their wisdom into your waking life. Until we meet again in the gentle darkness of another night, when other voices from history call to us across the centuries, sleep peacefully, rest well. Dream sweetly of a world where every child is safe, every orphan is loved, and every human being knows they are valued beyond measure. The Roman children are quiet now, their stories told, their courage celebrated. They watch over your sleep like ancient guardians, reminding you that love is stronger than abandonment, hope is more powerful than despair, and the human spirit, however tested, however strained, always finds a way to endure and flourish. Good night, dear traveler, sweet dreams, until the next story calls us home.